Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us here at the Atlantic Council for our event on borderless wars and challenges in the gray zone. My name is Daniel Chu. I'm the Deputy Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, and I'm Director of our Strategy Initiative. And the Strategy Initiative is particularly pleased to welcome Professor Antonia Chase from Tufts University here to talk about her book called Borderless Wars, and in particular to talk about what we will be calling gray zone challenges, and we'll tease that out a little bit more in the discussion today. Some of you I know have been here before and have heard me talk about the challenges of the gray zone and why I think that they are really critical for not only any administration to be thinking about, but in particular for us to be thinking about with regard to our own governmental structure and how we are structured to deal with what's going on in the world today. And I think you'll find a really interesting discussion on that here this afternoon. We're particularly proud to host this as part of the Scowcroft Center's partnership with Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where Professor Chase teaches. We're very pleased that we have the opportunity to go up to the Fletcher School from time to time to engage in discussions on key foreign policy and international security issues from the Atlantic Council's perspective. And we're equally pleased that Fletcher School is able to send to us both students and faculty who have an interest in these issues as well, and really broaden the discussion beyond just the DC community. We've seen gray zones, as I've mentioned before, develop as new challenges to the United States across regions and across issue areas. We've talked about gray zones in Europe, especially with regard to how Russia has been challenging the United States and our allies in Europe. We've also talked about gray zone challenges in Asia, particularly in terms of some challenges that are perceived by China to have fallen in between the cracks of what we normally characterize as national security challenges. We've seen gray zone challenges arise in issue areas like cyberspace, like space and elsewhere, where it's difficult to categorize what is a classical national security challenge and what is not. So we're going to be talking about that here today, not only because we've seen them happening, but we know we're going to continue to see them happening. And although we've been all witness to some rather dramatic events with the U.S. election here last week, these are challenges that would affect any administration and will affect any administration. I'm hopeful we'll have some discussion here about what the next administration might try and do, but again, I would really concentrate on these challenges for us as a government and as a nation beyond just a specific administration. The other thing we're going to do here today is try and engage in a slightly different exercise than the usual panel discussion that you usually get here at a think tank. We're going to do a couple of things. One is we're going to use a scenario, a wargaming type scenario, not so much to play a game or to have a war, but to use as a way to discuss some of these issues in a little bit more detail. As you know, as I've just done, gray zone can sound like a very interesting, complex challenge, and we can get into some very vague and conceptual discussions about that. But what's really challenging about them is when you start to pull the threads and really look at the details of it. So we're going to ask our panel here today, rather than to simply tell you what they think about gray zone challenges, to talk through a particular scenario as we do this in order to highlight some of those specifics and those manifestations of gray zone challenges. But we're not just going to have the panelists talking about it. We'd really like you all to join us in that discussion as well. So we have Ali Watkins here, national security correspondent from BuzzFeed, who's not only going to lead the discussion and has been invited to participate in the discussion, but encourage you all to join in the discussion as well. As you see the panelists raising issues, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you disagree, please raise those with us as we go along, because that's really an important part of exploring this gray zone challenge as we go forward. But we're going to start with at least an overview of the book from Professor Chase. And you have bios in your handouts that you might probably picked up on your way in. But I do want to introduce Professor Antonia Chase, Professor of Practice of International Politics and Law at Tufts Fletcher School. She taught at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Law. Chase was the vice chair of the Conflict Management Group, an international nonprofit dispute resolution organization. As board member of United Technologies Corporation for over 21 years, she chaired its Public Issues Review Committee and served on its executive committee until retiring in 2002. And during the Carter administration, she was assistant and later undersecretary for the U.S. Air Force, where she was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. I think that her bio speaks volumes for why she really brings not only a particularly unique but a particularly important perspective to thinking about gray zone challenges. And I think you'll really appreciate not only the discussion that we're going to have here today with her, but her book, which, by the way, is available in the lobby if you'd like to take a look at that. I should also let you know that this event is on the record. We are live streaming as I speak, and we're also tweeting, and if you're so inclined to tweet about this discussion, our hashtag is ACStrategy. And of course, if you'd like to learn more about our speakers, please take a look at the bios. But in the meantime, Professor Chase, it's a great honor to have you here. Very much looking forward to this discussion.
And I thank you, and I thank you all for coming, because this is, I know, a very lively and interesting group of people. In Syria, the CIA funded and trained combatants in the Free Syrian Army who seem to have had a plentiful supply of TOW missiles and have made advances against ISIS. But DoD trained forces dwindled down to five people, and the Secretary of Defense ended the program only to start it again recently. What's going on there? Who is performing what function? Do we understand the full nature of our involvement in the Syrian war? And what's going to likely change in the next administration? In Iraq, in 2003, what was supposed to come after a declaration of victory? As you recall, DoD created an Office of Special Plans that actually did some planning for post-war Iraq, but using exiles along with DoD civilians who were unrealistically optimistic that there wouldn't be any further fighting and that a democracy would emerge. The State Department had also been doing some planning, but it was fully excluded from the decisions. And the Coalition Provisional Authority replaced a hastily assembled post-war group, the OHR, and one of its first acts, as you all recall, was to fire all the Ba'athist personnel, leaving the military and the government leaderless. They were unable to pick up the reins of government, and chaos followed. Sunni exclusion prevailed and continued to prevail even after the Sunni awakening, and explains in part the original attraction of ISIS and now the struggle for Mosul and the grim deaths that are mounting. But despite all the American troops that are now, quote, training Iraqi soldiers who had been trained for years anyway, success in the battlefield is not really cemented. So what is likely to change in Iraq in a new administration? In Afghanistan, the US and Western leaders, having toppled the Taliban government in 2001, sought to build a stable democracy until 2006, worked through a constitutional process, through elections and the creation of a parliament. Efforts to build a government with popular support seemed promising, but in fact the structure was rotting from within. The 2009 elections were fraudulent. Widespread corruption by the Karzais and their circle had alienated the people. And the diplomats who did not communicate well with the military attributed the problems to government weakness. Sarah Chase, my daughter, who has written Thieves of State, describes it as a, quote, structured mafia-esque system in which money flows upward via purchase of offices kickbacks and bribes are in return for permission to extract resources. But our diplomats talk primarily to government officials, and the Karzais themselves were paid by the CIA, has been exposed by several New York Times articles. Any anti-corruption message was easily ignored. Now the Taliban is resurgent. Helmand province is substantially in its hands. The northern city of Kunduz has been seesawing in and out of Taliban control. U.S. policy switched to Afghan good enough, not a state that could be part of the international community. And Afghan refugees are fleeing to Europe. Why have things gone so wrong? In my book, Borderless Wars, I don't try to reach policy solutions to these problems because I wouldn't be that presumptuous. But I do try to deal with some limited issues that might suggest a better approach. The stage setting is the type of conflict in which the U.S. and our allies have become embroiled. You call them gray zones. I've been calling them a gray area. Doesn't matter, same thing. They're not traditional wars. Few are simple. Not all of them, but some of them are state on state. And they look different from the internal wars of the 1990s. And they're not fought only or even primarily by uniformed militaries. Some are internal wars, others are trying to or succeeding in obliterating traditional boundaries. And in some areas, Somalia, for example, it isn't full-scale war, but it isn't peace. That's the gray area, or the gray zone. And the standard repertoire of military responses are neither adequate nor appropriate. The lines of authority are blurred between civilian and military, and in that sense, we're faced with borderless. Then the law is also kind of borderless. The law of armed conflict is being stretched to apply to these situations, and it isn't really satisfactory. So I think all of civil-military relations are in flux, and we're subject to enormous pressures to create new models that are actually capable of dealing with the demands of what is happening, particularly the spread of ISIS and now even throughout Europe. So I picked three areas to look at. The first is counterinsurgency, and that seemed to have succeeded after the surge in Iraq in 2007, but we understand a bit better why it did fail. And I list several reasons, but one stands out, I think, for both Iraq and Afghanistan, which is the absence of a host government that can begin to build the trust of its people. And how can interveners tackle that question? There has to be an ongoing and a deep dialogue between the civilian and military leadership, capable of planning forward to the range of outcomes that might occur. The problems don't end when the shooting stops. And I'm struck by this lack of this kind of thinking with respect to Syria. Discussions get hung up on how many and what kind of boots on the ground, what targets for airstrikes. And if we don't have a civil-military dialogue that goes beyond that, we're not going to succeed in anything that we try to do or any forbearance that we may decide upon. And I've recommended a saturation approach, knowing that a plea for something like Goldwater-Nichols, which established inter-service cooperation, is unlikely for military-civilian cooperation. That's unlikely to happen. And some movement could be made by executive order. We're going to have a very good look at how durable executive orders are very soon. But we had in the Clinton era PDD 56, which mandated joint planning, training, and exercises among civil and military officials. We also can look what is more likely to be enduring at the models of some of the regional commands like Southcom and AFRICOM, where the military commander has a civilian deputy. And I don't think that is going to change. And that's been a very useful model in planning for the complexities of the regions in which these commands serve. In the second part of the book, I deal with counterterrorism and particularly targeted killing. And a major part of our efforts is just that in Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia. And since the terrorist threat is showing itself to be worldwide and shifting from place to place, drones have seemed to be an effective response. I agree with Michael Walzer, who has written that there is no intrinsic ethical issue about predators and reapers as a weapon system, but the civil-military issues are troubling. And while the function appears to be a military one, it is being carried out both by the military, the CIA, and actually now by contractors. The killing of the American citizen al-Awlaki by the CIA, and then a week later by his 14-year-old son, which was done by the military, stirred up considerable talk and discomfort in the United States. He was a bad actor, and but there were problems around that strike. First, the deep secrecy. It was only ended by court order. Second, the CIA has had a reputation for lawlessness, from the Bay of Pigs to waterboarding. And third, the legal underpinnings were kept secret. Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell of Notre Dame argues that a secret legal operation is an oxymoron. That isn't quite true, because a legal opinion really depends on describing the facts, and the facts may be classified, and that's in part why legal opinions are often classified. But nevertheless, it's really important to lay out the general basis, legal basis in both international and domestic law for actions that we take, particularly controversial actions. In the end, I spend many pages of analysis on this, but I think in the end I conclude, like Wagner's music, it's probably better than it sounds. The international issue, as I say, is, are we on a war footing, in which case the law of armed conflict applies, or is this really a series of discrete terrorist acts and then a very different set of rules apply? And President Obama made some inconsistent statements in first trying to distance himself from the Bush administration global war on terror. And we don't know how the Trump administration is likely to deal with this. Domestically, in the United States, the legal issues are very troubling as well. President Obama had asked Congress to update the authorization for the use of military force, the AUMF, which only refers, as you know, to al-Qaeda and the forces associated with the 9/11 attack. ISIS is not included, and Congress did not respond with legislation. He also invoked the War Powers Resolution, and Congress did not respond, and 60 days passed, and the military actions did not stop as was required. And then the question is, what powers beyond training does the U.S. now have in Iraq and Syria, and what is it that we're actually doing? The issue of oversight is another sore point. More effective oversight is needed, but little cooperation has been forthcoming from Congress, the congressional committees, and the FISA court hasn't demonstrated details oversight either. So a lot of the big issues in this area are blowback. Are we creating more terrorists for every one we kill? And secondly, we're already losing our monopoly of armed drones, and some international regulation is needed. Just think of the hobby drones on the White House lawn. So I've been talking about the possibility of openness to an international code of conduct as a starting point for regulations, and a number of people have begun to write in this subject. The third part of the book is the grayest of gray areas, and that is the cyber attack and cyber warfare. Estonia was attacked in 2007 by a source later attributed to Nash, a Russian youth group, and it brought the highly wired society to its knees very fast. So the question, of course, we all talk about is, when is a cyber attack the equivalent of war? And the easy answer has been when it's the equivalent of a military strike when people are harmed. But cyber attacks are much more complex. The harm may be delayed. Attribution of the attacker may take weeks, months, or never be clear. And some intrusions, cyber exploitation, espionage, are practices that no state is going to outlaw. And then the next question arises, the gray area of who should be in charge, civil or military. The big issue is that 95% of our infrastructure, and almost that much in Europe, is in private hands. So the Department of Homeland Security is in charge, and almost every government agency you can name has a finger in the pie, down to state and municipal levels. But the disparity of resources between DHS and the combined resources of Cyber Command and NSA is, in the unclassified budget, more than 5 to 1. And I guess DHS has improved its coordinating capacity from the disaster of Hurricane Katrina to Deepwater Horizon, but many of the problems have really remained. And there have been loads of simulations, and these are good, but I've asked people, why have the results not been made public? And I don't get a very good answer, unfortunately. And then more troublesome is the lack of legal guidance in the United States. Domestically, bill after bill has been introduced in the Senate, and industry has resisted any legislative standard setting or cooperation. So an executive order was designed to accomplish on a voluntary basis what was resisted in legislation. And the 2015 Act doesn't really regulate. So I think a ray of hope exists for international cooperation with the U.S.-China agreement of September 2015, not to engage in commercial cyber theft and to cooperate in making a common effort to develop norms of behavior. I call my chapter International Cooperation on Training Wheels, because it is just that, it's training wheels. And we learned in the nuclear and chemical weapons arena, norms of behavior are very slow to develop, and the record has been incomplete, but there is some momentum forward. So I end the book with a quote from Shakespeare: "It is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant." Democratic societies have the resources and the skills to engage collectively in curbing the brutality of the 21st century. Their giant strength is needed in the effort to protect against violent criminality while upholding democratic decency. That is the challenge that we now face, and we hopefully will not make too much of a regression upcoming. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Professor Chase. Thank you for that great talk. So we have Brian and Scott up here, two Atlantic Council Fellows. And we're going to have, this is a really unique way to have this conversation, I think, and different from a usual panel. I think we're going to be able to get some really interesting conversations out of this. So to stress again, please raise your hand, feel free to participate at any point in this. So basically we're going to lay out a scenario for you here. And welcome the panel to discuss this and kind of talk about how some of the theories and ideas that Professor Chase talks about in her book and in her talk kind of play into this scenario. So move with me to January 19th, 2017. We are on the eve of the presidential inauguration of Trump administration at this point. And I want to make sure I get this scenario totally right. So on the eve of the inauguration, we have a cyber attack that hits Swedish telephone companies, and it shuts off telephone service across Sweden. The attack is 99% attributable to Russian forces, and for 48 hours, no one within Sweden can communicate with each other via telephone. While this lack of communication is happening, shooters fire on a public square in Stockholm. 14 are dead, and there's many injured, and no one's able to communicate with authorities or let anyone know what's happening in this time frame. So we have a lot of different, we have about 10 different gray zones at play here. But broadly, in that kind of scenario, what is a US and European responsibility to help out there? And I'll open it up, whichever of you would like to take that.
Good.
So this is interesting, right? Because in this particular case, geography matters. Sweden is a NATO partner, but not a member of NATO, so there's no, you necessarily invoke Article 5 of NATO, and the question then becomes, you know, how do we think about escalation of this conflict? Why are they being attacked? And I would use this an opportunity to maybe make 2 points. Attribution is really difficult here because an attack emanating from Russia may not necessarily be an attack from the Russian government. And you know, I think that we can't solve the attribution problem during a conflict. That's something that you have to be thinking about, and probably thinking about very differently than we have been, given the asymmetry in the cyberspace, right? So I think if you're the United States trying to figure out, first, is it really Russia that's attacked, and why have they done that? And I would propose that I'm not sure we're set up to make that determination, not only quickly, but ultimately.
I think I'll just add a couple quick points to that. One is that it's a very complicated situation in terms of that, and I don't really like the term gray zone because it implies it's something new. This was an act of force used for a reason, to get something, to persuade something, to influence something. And I think the difficult thing for any administration right now would come in is that how would we respond to the Swedes? What do you want? How can we help you? Versus the U.S. muscling in and trying to manage that. Because it also is not a, as you said, not an Article 5 NATO type issue also. How do we respect our sovereignty, but also assist as able?
Professor Chase?
Well, you have the Nordefco. You've got a group of Nordic states that is the defense cooperation for that area. So I think the first thing the United States would do would be to say, what capabilities does your NORDEFCO not have that we might be able to help you with? And in a Trump administration, they might offer FBI, they might offer some intelligence help, but they might charge for it.
Yeah, I think I was going to kind of go off of this. You mentioned NATO obligations, and there are these questions, you know, NATO versus partner versus ally, et cetera. So, I mean, given the rhetoric that we know coming into a Trump administration, what are the questions that are raised there from a NATO perspective? What are our obligations in that kind of situation under NATO?
We don't have obligations under NATO because this is not an Article 5 situation. Sweden is not a member of NATO. So, I mean, that is pretty legally clear cut. The question is, you know, you've had an attack, people have been killed. This is not just a cyber attack where the communication system went down. This is not Estonia. So it's very worrisome. Who did the attack? How do we find out who did the attack? Can we help them find out? But intrusiveness, bringing NATO into it, taking over, I don't think so. I think you've got a very robust and wealthy set of countries up there, and I think absolutely any administration would want to defer to them first. Mm.
And when you talk, I know you talked a little bit about what qualifies as an act of war. What, you know, what in the cyber realm could qualify as an act of war, and it doesn't seem that we have a really clear, internationally agreed upon definition of that yet, or do we?
Absolutely, we do not. In the first place, we don't know whether they're local terrorists, whether they're terrorists at all that attack the people who were killed, or whether they have anything to do with the attribution that has been well, it's not tentatively made, it's 99% made that it was Russia. And as you point out, this could be another Russian group with or without the authority of the government, although I think the government probably would have quickly come up and said, it's not us. But then even if they did, would we believe it?
Scott, could you touch a little bit on this? I mean, what your ideas are of an act of war under a cyber attack scenario?
Yeah, look, I think when there's physical damage and there's escalation, if you're attacking the power grid, if you're impacting a country's infrastructure, and there's certain attribution to that, and you're having physical outcome, yeah, I think it's act of war can get clear really quick when there's physical damage and physical outcomes. But I think there's a bigger underpinning here that is difficult from a policy perspective, right? Number one, I think Sweden and Finland and the Scandinavian countries are very important to security in the region. Sweden has made big investments in cooperation with NATO, right? They're an active participant in NATO exercises. I think a threat to Sweden is something I think the United States has to consider, even though they legally don't have to, as they're not, as you point out, they're not a member formally of NATO. But I think you think about what an attack on Sweden means for the region. Right, and I think it illuminates a big problem we have. Yeah, there's some gray space here. Stealing information, distributed denial of service, is that an act of war? I think there's a lot of gray space in the middle that we don't have a convention around today to think about, and I think it would be helpful to have clarity there. But I would say that we talk about non-state actors today, and we think along the lines of how we thought about counterterrorism, right? We think about violent extremist groups that have deeply seated ideologies, but the reality of it is non-state actor groups might include criminal organizations, they might include political activists, they might include a whole variety of different types of actors that can now impact countries very physically. A taxi cab driver in Romania may have a stake in the race here. And so I think we have to start thinking differently about what we mean when we say non-state actors. I think the digital tools that have availed themselves mean you don't have to build the race car anymore to drive it. Automation and technology are allowing lots of players to have big mass-scale impact in the asymmetry of this. And I think we're in a situation where a lot of those non-state actors or post-national actors may have an incentive to influence a government or an outcome like this. And so I think we have a broader policy question, not just of what constitutes an act of war, but how do we think about attribution? Is our intelligence community set up to deal with this kind of asymmetry, this sort of distributed battlefield? And how are we going to enable lawmakers and POTUS and others in the future the tools and the information they need when somebody says, okay, we had an attack, it appears to be coordinated, there's a physical element, is Russia really behind it? And I would say, I think there are some bigger policy issues here about, it used to be that nation states were the most important actors, right? We focus on China, we focus on Russia, our diplomatic relationships, and how they may or may not be planning offensive operations in a conflict. But the reality of it is non-state actors, private companies, Google, Facebook, other organizations may be more important ultimately than nation states, and I don't think we've developed a sort of partnership concept. I don't think we're there yet from a policy standpoint on how to work with them to combat this issue. The last thing I'll say on this is attribution. We're really good at technical attribution, technical indicators. We can group attacks, modalities. We can then infer what groups they may have come from, why the attack happened based on technical indicators. We talk a lot about NSA and cybercom. But the reality of it is people attack. And there's a bridge between technical indicators that might point to a building and a server and a group and a modality, but may not tell us about that motivation. And I think that's what we need to think about. That becomes a very evident issue in an escalation like this one.
Mm-hmm. The attribution question, I think, is fascinating when we talk about this idea of cyber attacks. And I want to touch on that. But first, I want to ask you, Brian, you come from an interesting perspective on this being active duty military. When you talk about an act of war in a conventional sense, I think a lot of us know what that means. I think it's pretty well accepted within Washington what that means in a conventional military sense. Can you talk about what the challenges are from a military perspective when you're talking about an act of war and trying to define that within like a cyber battlefield?
I think it's a great valid question based on what we're talking here. I think it's a sliding scale. I think when we often want this binary solution, while A happened, so therefore we're at war now, that's an act of war. But I think it's still, there's two parts to that. One is a decision-making piece, because in many cases in previous conflicts, there have been technically acts of war before it would actually drive the U.S. military or the U.S. government to make a decision for war. You can go back to World War I, World War II, many different examples previously. Many things happened beforehand. I think the same thing we're seeing, same thing in cyber right now. In a situation like this, for example, let's say it happened in the U.S., there's a hesitancy to say, well, a person died, so hey, we're going to go full-on declare war on whoever we can try to attribute it to like this. And I think that psychologically we're not there yet. It's not a hard line. Much more it's a zone of possible, probable, and more highly influential. Usually we'll take a major trigger event, looking at World War II as the sinking of Lusitania. World War I, sinking of Lusitania. Look at other things like this. There are people that are killed every day due to various different things. I mean, traffic accidents, look how many people died from this. Are we willing to go to war over that? And that's where it really kind of gets a little fuzzy, I believe, in terms of those terms like that. We really haven't come to grips psychologically. We lack, like the Hague Conventions or the Geneva Accords. Okay, it's pretty well defined, a little bit of what conventional war looks like. What does cyber warfare, and where is that defined line? Because I would offer, if one person died, that's not it. I don't think that would be of great concern. But then there's I think, how many is it? Is it 10? Is it 100? We don't really know yet, and that's part of what we really haven't worked out yet. I think legally, intellectually, or just emotionally, where are we going with that?
Yeah, but let me just say, without being legally pedantic, act of war is not a legal concept. The question is this the kind of conflict that would, under various treaties, evoke a military response? I mean, is this something that Sweden would go to the UN Security Council and call for a military response. You've got so many facts here, and this is what makes the plausibility so great of this kind of a scenario. Clearly, when everything was brought down in Estonia, there was no, the Estonians did not call for Article 5. They did not ask for a military response. They were crippled, but there was no accompanying act of violence. People weren't killed. So I think what we're saying up here is there has to be something that parallels kinetic action to make it seem like a conflict, because a cyber attack that doesn't harm people is a very nasty thing and has to be dealt with, but we don't talk of it in terms of war. We don't talk of it in terms of military response. Now, when you've got a situation where people are actually killed, then you've got to think twice. Are these a bunch of criminals? Are they local? Are they terrorists? Is this an act of terror? Is it coming from outside? How should it be dealt with? So we've got, in all of these situations, we've got first and foremost a major intelligence problem. You've got to figure out what it is. So what the United States under any administration would do would be to offer, if there is superiority in intelligence, to offer some way of understanding what has been happening. That seems to be the first thing. Maybe what's required, 15 people killed. I mean, this could be, you know, a crazy criminal act that has nothing to do with anything remotely approaching war. Or it could be absolutely a terrorist act from either homegrown terrorists or terrorists from outside. So you got to know.
And I mean, this is the real challenge of a cyber attack scenario. And also, just to stress, again, any questions, any interpretations, any comments, please?
I think there's several faulty precepts in your scenario. First responders don't use cell phones. You may. So I'm willing to bet that there is some communication going on. Radio, television will probably still be up, so the government and authorities can respond and communicate with their population. I have no doubt in my mind that one of the NATO members would call for consultations under Article 4, and there would be a NAC immediately, because that would be a place where they can concentrate and figure out where they could best support the Swedes. So I think that there's a lot of issues like that would be most likely response.
Are you saying there's a way to communicate outside of cell phones?
For us old people.
Secure communications, but assuming that all communications did go down. I mean, it's possible for all communications to go down. They may not be sufficiently secure. If that were the case, you still have to find out what is happening. You still have to find out if this is a criminal action or a terrorist action or something else.
Okay, that's a premise. Thank you. So, assuming that a denial of service attack has occurred and has taken down all the networks in Sweden, you are suggesting that the terrorist attack that killed 14 people in the square was related to that event, and I question that premise. However, during those 48 hours when the networks were down, other people died in car crashes or house fires or other activities where they couldn't get service from the fire department or police. Those actions are certainly at the feet of whoever did this, too. Probably more than 14 people died during that period. So that's certainly of interest. I would also look, prior to your scenario starting, if you're supposing that the Russian government did this, They didn't do it for any random reason. They did it for some desired outcome. That perhaps Sweden was thinking about joining NATO. Perhaps Sweden was thinking about imposing sanctions, and they wanted to sway the government in a certain way. And suddenly this event happens. So it's not a thing that the Russian government would do randomly, willy-nilly. So I would sort of question that premise as well.
And then I would also recommend looking at 2 additional sources. While certainly not binding, could be helpful. So the Tallinn Manual, I'd recommend looking at that.
Yes, of course.
Yes, and then yes, Sweden is not a member of NATO, but interestingly, it is in an organization chartered by NATO. That's the Strategic Airlift Capabilities Consortium, which is has been headed by a Swede. And I'd also recommend looking at the language of that charter if that can be of any help as well. Thank you.
Hi, Jill Goldenzill from Marine Corps University. So, a few questions, I guess. First of all, so I agree that there's 2 separate issues here. First of all, there's the cyber attack, and then there's the terrorist act. And I guess the first question is, does it matter whether we consider these events together or separately at this point, given that we're 48 hours in, and there's still no way to communicate apparently, but not ability to communicate easily across the board, first of all. And secondly, if I'm understanding this correctly, so I don't have the book in front of me at the moment, but the book included many definitions of cyber attack. And there was no, or cyber warfare, I mean, and there was no agreed upon definition, but it seems like this type of attack would meet almost all of them that were in the book, if not all of them, because it's an attack on infrastructure. And if the military had attacked infrastructure in this particular way, it would almost certainly be considered an act of war, whether that's a legal term or not. We don't know what's going to happen at this point because we're 48 hours in and basically in chaos. But if the military had bombed something that would have destroyed infrastructural capacity for 48 hours, that would be considered an act of war that could immediately trigger international retaliation of some kind. So I guess I'm just not sure of why we're in such of a different scenario here. Like on one level, I can understand it obviously because it's not a military action that we know of, but on another level, it doesn't seem like there's that much of a difference in terms of impact.
If I could take that just for a second, going back to that kind of that continuum there, because you bring up an exactly valid point. That's kind of the crux of one of the issues right now. So going back to Stuxnet, going into Iran. Okay, well, was that an act of war? You could argue that it was. Was it for a good purpose? You could argue that it was also. But technically, you can make a very valid argument for that. But I think it goes back to what are we willing to make the decision. Just going back to the easy layup for World War I again. Those that died on the Lusitania were not the first Americans to die in that conflict. That was not the first ship to get torpedoed that had Americans. It was not everything else like this. But that was a trigger event where it hit a threshold. And I think that we're still struggling with that, I think, as just globally, where is the threshold? Okay, that's enough. Well, this time we'll be really mad at you, and next time we'll do something even, we'll send you an even more angry memo. Or is it, no, you crossed the line? That's where the miscalculation can come in. I mean, many conflicts, as we look through history, were started by miscalculation. You know, somebody's pushing the edge. If I can get to that line, I can push it. And oops, I either went a step further than I intended to, or that line was actually drawn a little lower than I thought it was. And now you have an escalating crisis, a much more quickly escalating crisis. Does that kind of help for your question on that?
I mean, obviously it's a blurry line, so there's no clear answer here.
Yeah.
But could some kind of military retaliation be justified at least? Could a lawyer argue that? I mean, I'm a lawyer, so of course I can argue that. But I would think, yeah.
But remember,
Please.
we're dealing with facts in which we believe, maybe with 99% certainty, that the cyber attack was caused by Russia. The attack on people is indeterminate. There are no Russians in there in Sweden. This is a different set of facts. So somebody has attacked the people and killed a number of people, and that the causal chain may come from the cyber. It definitely comes from the cyber attack, but it is important not to jump the gun and say, I mean, what would the government of Sweden be asking for, and whom would they be asking? As I said, active war is not a legal term. Where are they going to go? They're going to turn to their own defense group, the Nordefco. They're going to turn to NATO. What are they going to say to NATO? I mean, these are the questions that have to be explored. They first have to find out whether this isn't some kind of maniac going around shooting people in a square somewhere because it's dark and because there's no communication. And that would be a criminal act. So let's not move so fast to consider this an act of war or consider this a conflict of any kind that involves another nation. We don't know that yet.
Hi, Todd Rosenblum, a non-resident fellow here at the council. A couple things. One, I know we're just, we have to have assumptions, but it's I think, an enormous leap to make an assumption that all communications of a nation would be shut down. But just put that aside. I'm really supporting your last point on this issue of assumptions about war. And you asked, what would Sweden be looking for in this context? Chances are, and certainly wearing an American perspective, we're not looking at the military. We're looking at our law enforcement and our intelligence community first and foremost. You talk about thresholds, and I certainly also take the point in terms of a terrorist act killing 14 people is horrendous and awful, but also, to me, strikes me well below the threshold of declaring an act of war against someone. Third, I think this notion of thinking about military responses. Well, Russia's interfered in our election in the United States, and no one's talking about using the U.S. military in any capacity at all. We're looking at economic sanctions. We relied on the FBI to do investigations. I suspect if we have a response, we'd be looking at our intelligence community to do what it would do. So, I get it. I come from a Pentagon world as well, where the uniformed military has enormous organizational capacity and a can-do attitude. But I think when reality happens in this kind of context, it's much less likely that it's going to be a military-led dialogue or response.
I would agree with you 100%. I think this is fundamentally not even a military problem. It has military components that they could assist if the Swedes, and it was a policy decision by the president at the time, but it's fundamentally not a military problem.
I would disagree. How about Haiti?
Yeah.
We go in all the time with our military capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So
this gentleman right here
I agree with you, wouldn't go kinetic.
Right.
But one of the goals here is not to necessarily find out who did this, but to try to get Sweden back to status quo ante. So there would be efforts to try to counter the facts on the ground. How do we get the communications back? So one of your goals, I would hope, to deter people from resorting to this type of activity, if you don't get any bang for your buck, if you can try to counter what's occurring, I think that would be as much of a focus at the beginning and leaving towards the end who might have done it and for why.
I appreciate your comment in terms of that, but I think the lead for this would be the nation of Sweden. They would say, we would like a capability, FBI, military, this, that, or whatever it might
Yes,
be.
exactly.
And that's really what would drive that. I would not see, it would be a support role at best.
Right.
If that was a policy decision that we would say, sure, we'll send you, or we'll send you a bill afterwards, I don't know.
Gentleman right here in the light blue.
Thank you. Back in 1983, the movie War Games came out. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but it's about a high school kid who has a modem, and he dials into a military computer, and he finds what he thinks is a war game, and he starts playing and ends up launching a couple of nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. Now, this is something that's even more likely today because a lot more kids have access to computer networks and potentially break in. And in a case like this, it's clear that these missiles are US missiles being fired against Russia. It's really dangerous to overreact or to react quickly because something like that is entirely feasible.
Comments? We all,
I've got a
we all appear
15-year-old
to be
son,
in
and that
agreement.
scares me every day. So.
That's an even more horrible scenario.
I want to touch on something because it's come up in all of these questions and we've talked about it. The point remains that the first step after a cyber attack is the hardest, which is attribution, especially if you're going to talk about retaliation or any kind of retaliatory attacks. So I'd like to hear all of you on this. Scott, I know you touched on it first. Even taking this out of the scenario and putting it in a real-world scenario, we've seen the United States and the Obama administration in particular being incredibly hesitant to point direct fingers at countries for cyber attacks. The direct attribution to Russia for this meddling in the U.S. election was only the second time I think we've ever publicly called someone out, the first time being the Sony hack by North Korea. And in calling out Russia in this election issue was under a lot of pressure, both from Congress and the White House, even up until the week before they announced it. Several intelligence community reporters, including myself, were hearing from people that the White House really did not want to publicly accuse Russia of this. So can we talk a little bit about the challenges of attribution in a cyber realm, why countries, including ours, tend to be hesitant to call them out, and what some of the challenges there are when something could so easily be misattributed?
Yeah, well, it's because of the gray space. It's because today, and I think you're going to see this even more so over the next 5 years, that you don't need to be able to build the race car to be able to drive in. To the gentleman's point, the weaponization of information, these tools, automation, is going to allow just about anybody to be destructive in cyberspace. And so you pull together a more sophisticated set of post-national actors that want some level of global influence for a whole host of different reasons, not just the ones we're used to thinking about, idolized, radicalized violence, but other actors, and I think that you've got a lot of gray space to contend with. For the President of the United States to conduct the diplomatic mission effectively, to respond, to maybe intentionally escalate in kind, to have an offensive capability on the information operations side, to conduct any of that, you need some level of certainty. And I think we're far from, even today, let alone 5 years from now, being able to know anything with absolute certainty, right? And so you risk escalation in cyber conflict, which we have no institutional memory, and we don't know when that converges with physical conflict, what the unintended consequences are. And so I think the professor had it right early on. We have a major challenge for the intelligence community, and not just the signals intelligence and the technical side, the human side, over the next 5 years of in something that's growing exponentially, many more non-state actors involved in many countries, cyber mercenaries as we've called it. Some of them, by the way, being proliferated by states themselves, hiring and working because of supply and demand, and for attribution reasons, intentionally using third parties. Now we have tools, skills, and capabilities, unlike traditional weapons of mass destruction, which we understand how to track. It's difficult, but to move a tool or a skill or a capability in the digital domain is really easy. Somebody steals it from NSA or some other capability, that can be proliferated exponentially and very quickly. And anybody, I think, in this day and age who says a third party, non-government, less sophisticated actor can't do scale damage, I think that's wrong today. I think that's the wrong starting point for the discussion. And so from an intelligence standpoint, I think as that asymmetry grows over the next few years, I think it necessitates a different working relationship than the one we have with the private sector. And I don't think we've figured that piece of the equation out yet.
I think the difficulty with all that just goes back to what you were saying, is just the difficulty of attribution, because it allows for miscalculation, but also it allows for diffusion. I would just ask, let me explain that for a second. If we were all in a dark room and somebody hits me in the back of the head, and then suddenly the lights come on, and if I knew it was Scott, I'd be mad and we'd have at it right now. But if the lights go out, somebody hits me in the back of the head, and I don't find out for a week who hit me in the back of the head, and it was Scott, by that time he's already gone. I'm probably moved on to something else. It didn't hurt that bad. I'm moving on to something else. It allows for diffusion of outrage, I guess, for lack of a better term. At that point, you start losing will to act if it's something on that borderline in that gray area of, well, I got away with it type of thing. So that's just the only thought I have on it.
You know, maybe it doesn't matter so much how we characterize these attacks. Maybe what really matters is that we understand what this technology can do, and we have got to come to some kind of an agreement of what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate behavior, what is intrusive in, even if it is not kinetic, what is intrusive and disruptive that ought not to be permitted as among states. I mean, we still have states. Yes, we have non-state actors, but we still have governments, and we have cooperation among governments. Maybe it's time to, you know, without the characterization, is this a conflict? Is this an armed conflict? When does it become an armed conflict? I mean, that's a nice question, and it's a good question for scenarios, and it's a good question for real life. Because it has occurred. I mean, it's occurred in Estonia, it's occurred in Georgia. Command and control can be decimated even in the middle of a war because everything is dependent upon the technology and the internet. So maybe it's time for us to anticipate scenarios that are so disruptive that they can bring a country to its knees, and therefore we need some kind of agreed upon regulation that we might start very, as I point out in the book, very tentatively with in terms of codes of conduct to move us forward to international cooperation where these things will be prevented, where these things won't be permitted, where the weight of thought of people who participate in government is, this is something we don't do.
Thoughts?
Hello, Colonel Ivan Mikuš from Embassy of Slovenia. Just a curiosity, when we were talking policy approaches and you defined the Nordic cooperation, NATO Article 4, none of you mentioned that Sweden is also a member of the EU. And EU is regulating all these things that we are now debating, plus the critical infrastructure, and following the example of France, for example, that they didn't choose to take the vehicle of NATO, but they chose something else. So can you comment on this?
Well, the EU has had very little regulation on infrastructure. I mean, they're just really at the very beginning of the process of trying to get agreements on cyber, and particularly cyber attacks. So I don't think they've moved very much beyond that in terms of agreements. I mean, there are certain acts that are criminal, but beyond that, I think we're at the very threshold of agreement. Europe might be more likely to come to some kind of international regulatory standards, but we're not there yet.
Well, the technical nuance and legality aside, I think the really important question is Sweden systemically important to the security of Europe and the United States, and what does that mean for our leaders and the decisions they have to make in both assistance in a crisis, but also as we think about our diplomatic and our security mission, what offensive measures we take against those who wish to unseat democracy globally. The bigger question is, are we really compelled to do other things because they're systemically important, even whether or not there's regulatory or legal requirement to do so?
I think that's a really interesting thing to throw in here, and I'm going to take it in the direction of intelligence sharing as we're talking about the question of attribution. And I think this is a very timely thing to discuss given Brexit and these new questions about EU security. So when you have something like this happen in Sweden, going back to our scenario here, like we said, the first step is attribution, and the U.S. traditionally would offer intelligence help on fronts that they are able. And we have this question of EU intelligence sharing, which I think is, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at that. You know, is there a standing agreement? How does that sharing happen? So can we talk a little bit about how intelligence sharing would work in this kind of scenario, and what different boundaries you have, whether with the EU or across the Atlantic? Brian,
Okay.
I think everyone's punning to you on this.
First of all, I'm not an intelligence guy, so that's my caveat up front. I think it's going to be a huge policy thing. That's very, very sensitive in terms of how much, what we can share and who we can share it with. But a lot of that would have to go back to senior executive leadership on if we can assist, and they've asked for help, we agreed to help with them. That would be a policy decision on the boundaries of how much we're willing to share. Because the assumption is it would go to Sweden. If it went to the EU, I mean, it would disperse the course and where it goes. So that's really going to be a policy decision on how much we're willing to share with them at that point. Being a good neighbor may go deeper, or there's some things that we may not be willing to share. So that's probably the best thing I would have to say, is that it would be a significant policy decision.
Mm-hmm. But really, it's more likely to be ad hoc sharing, and given an event, there would be a decision of what to share at that time, rather than having some broader, I mean, as far as the United States is concerned, I know that there are specific arrangements that we have with our allies, but I think in a situation such as the scenario, that decision would be likely to be made at the moment, given all the possibilities of revealing sources and methods that we might not be eager to do as a general proposition. We could give them some results, but these things are so highly classified, and they're so, as I say, they're so complex in terms of what in principle, what in actuality in a particular situation is likely to be left open and to whom, that I think it's very hard to make a generalization. What occurs to me, though, as we talk about this scenario and as I think about what I wrote in the book, is that any war, any conflict that we're going to be engaged in that involves non-state actors and involves the kind of terrorism that we've seen is likely to bring in all of these issues. I mean, there isn't any future conflict that is not going to involve cyber in some measure. Yeah. And I think, the security of everything is very dependent on our understanding that the attack is going to attack civilian, non-governmental controlled facilities that are essential to the security of any nation, of any Western, any developed country. So how do we deal with this? How do we bring, and particularly in a new administration, how do we bring industry and business along into some kind of cooperation so that we are not vulnerable to attack. I mean, it isn't just the command and control that's going to be attacked. It is going to be the communication system. It is going to be the electric grid. How do we deal with that? And as I say, a lot of exercises have been done. I don't know whether anybody here knows, more than my research, which was unclassified necessarily, revealed. I don't now have access to classified information, so I really had to depend on what was printed and what has been written about both by scholars and by journalists. How do we get to convince those companies that control the infrastructure that they are really part of the first line of defense of a country and need to cooperate?
Scott, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think post-Snowden, we have a big trust issue. We haven't figured it out yet. The brand of privacy is really valuable to technology companies like Apple, right? And when partnership sort of damages, when partnership with the intelligence community on the national security mission damages your brand, there's an issue. And I think that President-elect Trump and whoever he appoints as his national security advisor ought to consider convening a small group of private sector people to think about this problem and bring in folks from the technology community quietly but robustly to figure out where there is a meeting of interest here, because there's certainly a meeting of interest from a security standpoint where the government can be helpful, but on intelligence sharing, we share technical indicators with our private sector partners, but we don't really share the attribution stuff, right? And a lot of the information sharing is more robust between private sector companies and between government and the private sector. So a lot of folks in the private sector still consider the information sharing mechanisms inadequate for what they would like to have, and in some cases they don't need to have what they would like to have. But that's not important. What's important is we haven't figured that piece out yet. So I just think we would be well served to come back to that. But I think post Snowden, this is a very difficult conversation to have.
Anyone out here have any other thoughts? Yeah.
So international cooperation was discussed as a kind of a way to come up with some norms that would govern, some of these decisions, what constitutes an act of war, et cetera. It seems to me one piece that's missing is deterrent. In the nuclear age, we had a really clear deterrent, right? We had a couple thousand ICBMs pointed at the Kremlin. It was pretty clear. Right now, in the cyber domain, what, if any, deterrent is possible? There's a lot of talk of developing capabilities, offensive and defensive, but not a lot of discussions about cyber deterrence. Do you have any comments?
Deterrence model, the traditional deterrence model doesn't work in the cyber regime for, I think, reasons most people at this point understand. But the intelligence community, for example, to meet or reciprocate an action, for example, what happened in, what we perceive certain countries did during our election process, and Russia was named, obviously, an offensive strike in a similar way or a similar information operations campaign there may reveal means and methods in the intelligence community doesn't want to divulge, because that will then destroy some of those channels and means and sources, or at least expose them in a way that isn't good for part of the defense community. And so I think in light of not having a traditional deterrence model, we have to think about where do we get comfortable in the intelligence community taking more risk than we're used to thinking, because we don't have a lot of choices left. There are some that believe without a good offensive strategy, and maybe in kind, not necessarily to suggest escalation to physical or kinetic war conflict, but should we launch an information operations campaign after we're comfortable with attribution on the state actors that were involved in some of these scenarios, some of these incidents? If we get comfortable with attribution, should we similarly expose them? Is that the only way to sort of prevent future attacks, or is some thinking that may be the only thing we can do, but that might be very uncomfortable for the intelligence community based on how we've been operating, right? And so I think trade-offs are going to happen. I haven't heard a deterrence model that makes sense for cyber based on what we know.
Sorry, go ahead. You're gonna...
No, I was going to say there is the deterrence of our whole defense establishment. I mean, nuclear deterrence may, in the end, as we look back on it, if you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, may not have been as powerful. I mean, to launch a nuclear weapon in actuality, as opposed to in theory, is something that was unlikely ever to happen. These weapons existed as deterrent weapons, and there was mutual assured destruction, certainly in theory. I mean, we do have a very robust military establishment. An attack that is the equivalent of a kinetic attack can be, by the United States and certainly by NATO, be responded to in a military manner. That is deterrence. The point is, it isn't very fine-grained, and we don't know how to deal with these partial attacks that are in this gray area, the gray zone, that isn't really war. So deterrence is not really a relevant concept for something that isn't like a conflict, isn't like a military conflict. It doesn't really work. We've got to think more effectively as to how to prevent rather than how to retaliate. And I don't think we've got the right civil-military cooperation in all of this, either in the government, and particularly because we must involve the private sector in that. And I don't think we know how to do that. And the more we sort of spin these possible scenarios, the more it becomes obvious that we need domestically a great deal of interaction and communication. The idea that in a new administration there would be that kind of a talk is very good. Is that likely to happen with the administration and the Congress that has just been elected? I mean, do you foresee that kind of forward-looking cooperation? Is there the kind of...
Well, you have a president-elect that comes from the private sector, so one can hold some aspiration that there'll be some, as they call it, Washington non-insiders in the dialogue. But I think that's a to be determined. On one hand, he very well may put together a coalition of the willing from the private sector, and I think he'd be well served not to boil the ocean. We put together these, national commissions on cybersecurity, and we try to solve 1,000 problems. I think we have one big problem today. We don't have a clear vision for what we mean when we say public-private partnership, and no one has figured out how to regain the trust of the private sector community post-Snowden. And so I think something very focused on that would serve them well.
So I think this is a great and very timely discussion, but I want to push you on where our next administration may go, with the caveat that I think the only thing that anybody agrees on in Washington today is that we're in a wait-and-see mode on exactly where the next administration will go. But there's two aspects in particular I'd be interested in on maybe what you'd recommend as opposed to predict. So one is, Professor Chase, this is going to sound like an unfair question because I think you just said you don't know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. The thing that your book, the thing that this scenario really highlights is all the lines that we traditionally think are out there in government, between government and the private sector, between issue sets, get crossed in these gray area type conflicts. And my concern is that, but the government structure we still have, the rules, the regulations, the processes, all still follow the traditional lines. So, I hate to put it in the terms everybody's talking about now. In the first 100 days, what could any new administration do to try and change some of that? Because on the one hand, it's easy to say we should change it. On the other hand, it's very hard to even figure out what's the first change to be made, what's the first area to address this. How can we improve this situation? Maybe not all at once, but down the road, how can we improve this and what needs to be done? Sure seems to me it needs to be done early, because once you're in the middle of an administration, things are just happening, and it's very hard to say, I think we need to change the structure of the process here. So that's question one for all of you. I'd be interested in where you think to start trying to change things. Question two is, I think as we all would agree, although it's been challenging through the presidential election, words are really important. And so I'm wondering what you think, in addition to, for example, meetings with the private sector, which you suggested, Scott, might actually be quiet meetings as opposed to public meetings, in addition to doing the actual work of trying to address this situation, what could a President Trump say or tweet that would set the tone, that would set the direction to hopefully get us in a better position on gray area type of issues? Or is there anything that can be said or done in that area?
Here we are at the Atlantic Council, and maybe it is the function of a group like this to convene industry and government and begin to talk about the blurred lines and the lines that are going to remain blurred between civil and military, and come up with a kind of study and not wait for the government, but to make that available to the government. And in terms of just saying, as you begin to think about, it isn't just my book, there are a lot of books that have been written, a lot of articles that have been written, and we really understand that the lines are blurred, not only between civil and military in government, but out of government, and that the vulnerability of to a cyber attack of any kind is huge. And to try to come to grips with it, maybe this is a better convening vehicle than asking the government to convene when the reins of government are going to be taken up, with such things as repealing Obamacare or whatever else was in the campaign promises. This is probably too rational and too unglamorous for a new government to make a big splash about. But it's going to exist, and we don't know whether there'll be a cyber attack in 30 days or not for 4 years, but that there's going to be one that will be crippling is certainly going to happen because the means are available. And I guess that would be the approach that I would take. And let me just say that we will cooperate with you if you want to do it, because I think, the more I hear this discussion, the more important I think it really is. But it is unglamorous.
We're kind of low on time, but I think it's an important question.
So in brief, and I think the key thing at this point is that it would be the defense, just like we had Defense Reorganization Acts in the 40s, we had Goldwater-Nichols in '86. What we haven't seen yet is the Interagency Reform Act of 2017, right, by which our diplomats and our interagency partners labor under archaic and stovepipe rules that almost inhibit a entrepreneur approach to problem solving. I think that's probably, and also just how we handle and invest in and manage our federal workforce is probably a bridge too far, but again, if I had the magic wand you asked for, I'd do that.
Yeah, I will make a couple of basic predictions. I think that President-elect Trump will double down on information sharing, intelligence sharing, and how we do that. And I think that will continue to be a priority in cybersecurity from what I've heard from his folks that were working in his campaign as they go along. I think that it's very unlikely. Some people have talked about the next president coming in thinking about retaliation and an escalation as one possible way to deter future actions. I can't imagine from everything we've heard about his views on Russia and what he wants his diplomatic position to be that that's what's going to happen with Russia. But certainly we know that that campaign has talked an awful lot about understanding the impact of trade secret theft, IP theft, and the impact that that's having on Western companies trying to do business in Asia, and particularly with China. And so I think that what I've heard from his camp is that there will be a focus on that. I don't think they've yet are ready to put a full plan out. But I would say on the deterrence piece of this and the intelligence, what needs to happen to prepare us over the next 5 years within the intelligence community. Russia during the Cold War, I think, understood exactly what our military capabilities were, and that acted as a deterrence. I think it is very unclear to nation states what our capabilities are because we haven't exercised them. And in the private sector, we look at power utilities and we say they're going to go from Pop Warner to the NFL, and they're going to go from Pop Warner to the NFL simply because they haven't really been attacked wholesale. It doesn't mean that adversaries haven't compromised those systems and could, at some point during a conflict, exercise something that would be very damaging inside the U.S., right? And so the intelligence community knows that as they begin to exercise that capability that's been built up, that it now could act as a deterrence, but it also creates issues for the intelligence community to continue to be able to do what they do well. And so we have a real issue where we're going to have to take risk. And I think looking back at the intelligence community, I think POTUS and in particular the National Security Advisor has to be hands-on with the private sector, can't be delegated 1 or 2 steps below to a commission or a commission that's not attended regularly, and it needs to be senior leaders, and I don't think just senior leaders here in the United States. I think we have to have that discussion with our allies and also with people we perceive to be our adversaries. And I think we need to think about, can our human intelligence machine scale with this issue? I'll leave you with this final point. We thought we had a big success when the FBI and the U.S. Justice indicted in absentia these 5 members of PLA for hacking. Okay, and what happened shortly after that is those capabilities that were already highly distributed inside of China were pushed into the Ministry of State Security. And the Ministry of State Security in China immediately began hiring contractors and financing this international marketplace we have for, as you say now, non-state actors. Are we set up? And it comes back down to exactly what you said, Brian. We're compartmented. I understand why we're compartmented. I understand why that's important for the intelligence community. But if we don't start to break out of some of those molds, we're not going to keep up with this exponentially growing asymmetric threat.
Well, I think regardless of your predictions, cyber or otherwise, we are in for an interesting first 100 days for sure. So I think that wraps up our time. Thank you all so much for coming, and great discussion.
Thank you.